Hi everyone, it's Sandra and I'm out here with Cinderella, my indoor-outdoor worm bin. The last time I was in Cinderella, I was musing about whether it might be time to divide this bin, maybe split it, or certainly do a harvest. There's Prince Charming, my adorable feeding zone indicator. And so I did some digging into the research on the differences between domestic and wild worms in terms of density, specifically related to Eisenia fetida, and also what the effects of overcrowding or even undercrowding are on the worms and the quality of the vermicompost. Now, I'm not going to be able to remember all the figures off by heart as I go through Cinderella here and just dig out these corn cobs. So at the very end screen, I will put sort of a summary of the research findings, and in the description, you'll find links to some of the research itself. So the first thing that I found absolutely fascinating about my research into Eisenia fetida, or the red wiggler, was that the red wiggler basically developed or started to thrive hand in hand with agrarian societies. So as humankind started to domesticate animals and do agriculture, red wigglers really gained their place as a valuable contributor to the success of our composting and now our vermicomposting systems. Consistent throughout the research was referring to the red wiggler habitat as a disturbed habitat. So in the true wild, they developed in grasslands that were subject to flooding, animal grazing, temperate climate, and pretty consistent moisture. So where in the world were these original grasslands where the red wigglers were first located? Well, they stretched from southern Scandinavia through the Baltic states all the way to western Siberia. But the real heart of red wiggler origins are in countries that we now know as Ukraine, Romania, and southern Russia. So as I typically do, I'm just going through Cinderella and finding the really chunky stuff. This bin was not really set up for a harvest, but harvest I think I must do eventually, because you can see the compression and how difficult it is for me to turn over right to the bottom of this bin. And I think that the worms would do better with new bedding and maybe higher density, because the bedding level will drop. Okay, so getting back to why the red wigglers might have developed in grasslands. Well, like I said, the research said that they are worm species. There are worm species that respond really well to disturbed habitats. And like the grasslands were never the same. They, like I said, were subject to flooding. They were subject to animals. And what do animals do? Well, their hooves will turn up the soil. They will maybe even dig burrows. They will deposit manure. And this, of course, we all know is where red wigglers excel. So you've heard me say so many times in my videos, well, I'm trying to create a forest floor for my worms. Well, guess what? Red wigglers are very low density if they are located in a forest environment. I will put the stats on that at the end screen, like I said, but a forest floor is relatively stable. It might get a deposition of leaves or needles maybe once a year in the autumn and winter months. And then throughout the rest of the year, the animals, if they are present in the forest, don't tend to graze all over. They tend to have, pattern routes that they follow through a forest where the brush might be thin enough for the animals to travel. So the manure is not deposited evenly like it is on a grassland. And, so all this stuff about putting leaves in my bins and I'm trying to give the red wigglers exactly what they grew up on, maybe natively, well, that's not the truth. It doesn't mean they don't love it. But I'm just kind of going to the research to say, well, where did these worms evolve and how can we relate that maybe to how we raise them now in captivity? So the research found that even where red wigglers are native to the area, they are there in relatively low densities. because the habitat is prone to, like I said, flooding or animal migration, animal disturbances, things like that. The red wigglers tend to also, their populations tend to ebb and flow. And even when one of the research studies says they deliberately tried to introduce red wigglers, I think it was Costa Rica, around some coffee farms, and they tried to deliberately introduce red wigglers into the forest environment surrounding these farms, and they found the densities similarly. They just stayed low. The worms did not excel like we might find in a controlled vermicomposting system. Now I have to get some bedding for my worms. And sure enough, I'm giving them leaves today. The research said that there are 3 reasons why red wigglers in the wild tend to stay in relatively low densities. One of them is that substrate depletion, like I said, the organic matter can get washed away in a flood, or the animals may migrate out of that area periodically and the manure load lessen in the grassland. But the third reason is predation. In the wild, worms can get eaten by other animals, and that normally doesn't happen in our bins. Okay, I'm feeding Cinderella some moldy squash. It's not pumpkin and it hasn't been frozen. So let's hope this is enough to attract the worms. It's a bit mushy. So now let's compare that to what we find here with a domestic bin or a controlled environment for Eisenia fetida. And the researchers found that these bins can have 2 to 5 times more worms in them in terms of density, because we control things like moisture, we give consistent food, and we keep the temperatures right in that sweet zone for the worms. Unfortunately, though, because we are controlling everything, we can overcrowd worms. And researchers looked into that as well. They're not going to grow as much, they're not going to reproduce as much, and they basically go into survival mode as they are constantly on the hunt for food. At the extreme, they may actually cannibalize their own cocoons, and the juveniles cannot compete with the adults, and so there's a high juvenile mortality. One of the ways you can know that you're overcrowding your bin is if you haven't changed anything, if you don't have all new bedding and the worms are trying to escape, that could be an indication. Also, the worms may start to cluster. You may find clumps of them on the surface. And the red wigglers may emit that selenic fluid that has a really rotten smell to it. In terms of undercrowding, and remember I'm going to put an end screen with some of these density figures that the research cite at the end. Undercrowding, the worms are happy. They grow up to 30% bigger. When they can find a mate, they reproduce more often. But because there's so few of them, the vermicompost may be unevenly processed. Certainly it's going to take longer to process. And because you're starting with fewer worms, your worm population is going to grow more slowly. Okay, so thanks everyone for watching, and here's the facts and figures from the research.